Welcome to the presentation on how to give clear presentation. You'll notice that this is a presentation built on things I learned from Jane Abbott, who you've met, Patrick Winston, who you probably have not met, and 7 years as a tour guide. Much like the mystery box of awesome, the objective of this talk is to give you a baseline set of tools. I'm going to point out that you won't use every one of these tools every time, but you will hopefully use some of these tools when it matters. So, Professor Patrick Winston argues that your success in life is determined by a lot of things, but chiefly by your ability to speak, your ability to write, and the quality of your ideas, in that order. People come into this class and to various places in the world with varying levels of experience and comfort with public speaking. We've seen a little bit of that already. But by the end of this talk, you will have a basic set of tools for how to give clear presentations. The outline of this talk, we're going to talk about how to start, some heuristics for slide making, how all of this applies to your design reviews, and how to stop. So first, how to start. You could start with a joke, but probably don't do this in most cases if it's a new audience. The audience isn't ready for it yet. They're still trying to get used to you as a person, as a speaker, and you're still trying to set the tone for the speaking that you're going to do. You might use a joke later, but the beginning is probably a little too early. You could start by introducing yourself. You may or may not need to, depending on context. So for example, I didn't give a full introduction myself here because I already did. You could start with a story. Since stories tend to be longer than jokes, you get to use the story to set the tone for the rest of your talk. So these are 3 different ways to look at starting a presentation. One other way to do it is to start with a promise. What is your audience here for? So if you think about how we started this class last week with our introductions, with our learning objectives were our promises as teaching staff to you as students. And at the beginning of this talk, I promised you that by the end of this talk, you'll have several useful tools in your arsenal for presenting in front of others. Now moving on to heuristics and slides. I'm going to give to you 4 sample heuristics for giving talks. A heuristic is a simple, efficient rule to solve a problem. It may not be the most accurate or useful every single time, but it tends to be simple and efficient. The first heuristic, cycle through your ideas. A cycle is a spaced repetition of the same idea to ensure that everyone gets it, even if they zoned out the first time. You tell them what you're going to tell them, and then you tell them, and then you tell them what you just told them, as a means of cycling through your ideas. The second heuristic is to build a fence. Distinguish your ideas from someone else's ideas. This means that you tell us what your idea is and what your idea is not, which is particularly important in pitches. This talk is a combination of what I learned from Jane Abbott and Patrick Henry Winston, but in the context of design of assistive technology as presented to high school students. I just told you what this talk is, what the context is, what it isn't. Next, verbal punctuation, outlines and pauses, repetitions and rhythms of your speech. They give opportunities for people to get back on the rails of your talk if they kind of drifted away at some point. What might a 4th heuristic be? A fourth heuristic might be to ask a question. This invites the audience to think, to ponder, and to decide. And this can be a way to help with engagement. As you've noticed during a lot of these lectures, a lot of it has been back and forth to ask a question to the audience, figure out what you're interested in, ask a question back to the speaker, follow up, and so on. One way to remember these four heuristics is with a story mnemonic. So your job today is to come up with a mnemonic story to remember these four heuristics. I'm giving you a bit of a hint of one way I try to remember them. And it's going to be your job to come up with your own way. You can take this way, but it generally works better if you come up with your own story. Now I'm going to give you a warning. There's going to be an abrupt transition to the next slide. Ready? We're going to talk now about crimes against slide making. You can read right off your slides. Be sure to inform your audience that you know how to read. This is important to establish your credibility. You can use small font sizes to fit as much information into your talk as possible. You can use fun clip art to make sure that your audience gets a break, and use animations whenever possible to punctuate your points. Logos are awesome and show that you're legit and associated with important institutions. I'm gonna pause here for a moment, cleanse your palate. How to assemble slides. You can use words as guidance. So the secret is you can actually read off your slides, but your words should be guidance and cues, and your verbal track should add to your slides. Now, importantly, as a caveat, you should ask if your slides are meant to stand alone. Standalone slides are very different and much more wordy than slides made for oral presentation. And I'll answer this question right now. We will not ask you to make standalone slides for this class. Next, ensure font legibility. But also remember that not all text on a slide is meant to be read. Sometimes you're showing essentially pictures of documents. A warning against that is that although text may or may not be meant to be read, all text invites reading, so people will try to read it. So you should be careful when using very small text. You should use purposeful visual aids. You should have a reason for every visual aid that you put on your slides. So I chose the pictures earlier very intentionally because I think that together they form a good way for you to remember the four heuristics. You can use intentional animation. Animation should generally be used fairly sparingly, but they can be there to help a viewer focus, as well as to help illustrate particular points. But don't just use them because you think they look cool, right? And finally, sparing logo use. So logos on title slides make a lot of sense, but the only context that I can immediately think of where you want logos on every slide is if you believe that a slide might be viewed out of the context of your presentation and you really want to know people to know where it came from, then fine. Yeah, that makes sense. But generally speaking, put them on the title, and otherwise you can remove them because they just take up space and are visual clutter. Let's talk about slide and slide layouts. So Western audiences focus on the top left first, and they tend to read down, across, right? So depending on where you are in the cultural context, you need to choose an appropriate layout for your context. You can use different kinds of visual methods to help your reader focus. I use grayouts oftentimes in my slides so that I can show a lot of text, but very clearly point out where you should be focusing. And again, avoid unnecessary slide elements. Purposeful repetition is a technique that you can use to help keep the audience engaged by acting as verbal punctuation to people who might have zoned out and give them a way back into your presentation. Note that this is not the first time I have said this. This can be internal to a slide, or it can be throughout your presentation as a form of cycling, as we're doing right now. Now let's talk about your design reviews and the presentations that you will be giving for those. Introduction. Oftentimes, the first thing that we ask people to do is to connect with the audience. What does your audience care about? Why are they here? However, in this class, in presentations that are internal to our course, you probably don't need to do very much to connect to the audience because they know why you're there, they know what they're doing there, and they know the purpose of this presentation. But we might ask you to do this anyway, just as a form of practice. You might introduce your topic, right? Your topic in this case might be your co-designer, the problem that they're facing with a particular activity of daily living. Your objective is to solve that problem with your co-designer. And you might be trying to convince us that you have a good way of solving it and that you've thought it through. You might also be asking for help in the form of technical questions or connections or funding. In the background section, you need to introduce things like knowledge, motivation, and interest. In some cases, your audience, also staff and students, already know some things about your product, but we might have forgotten or want a reminder because there are many of you. Or we just want you to present it so that you have a chance to practice. So we'll be specific in our requirements as to how much background and detail we want you to give. Then you need to go through what is your motivation and why the audience should care. Again, depending on the context of your audience. In the main body of your presentation, start with something that your audience knows before bringing us into unknown territory, especially if it involves introducing new ideas. Lead with the familiar and land on the important. As an example, we might say something like, given what we just described about my co-designer's limited mobility and desire to play golf, these were our product design requirements. As technical presentations, your design review slides will probably contain more content per slide than what you're seeing here because you need to provide the context. But as a general rule of thumb, keep in mind that content-dense slides should be treated as taking about 1 minute per slide during the main body portion. Now, how do we present complex charts and diagrams? Because those will come up. My recommendations are to use builds and to highlight salient parts. Here's an example. This is a slide we want to build to, and there's a lot of stuff going on, but it isn't necessarily more complicated than some of the diagrams you might put up in your presentations. So I'm presenting this slide to you completely out of context, so don't worry about the technical content of the slide, but just focus on how the slide builds. So for this experiment, we start with hardware familiarization, then give the subject some practice with the exoskeleton before leading into main trials. Practice is 12 grasps. Each trial is 48 grasps, and there is a 2-minute break and a survey between each trial. There is also a 5-minute break at the end, during which subjects will fill out a NASA task load index survey. We'll repeat this procedure 2 more times for a total of 3 controllers. The AC controller updates itself after each trial, but we also perform post-hoc updates during the non-adaptive trials to look at the counterfactual of what the exoskeleton's behavior would have been if it did update. The counterfactuals tell us about the human-only adaptations to the exoskeleton, using the exoskeleton's programming as a proxy. The in situ mapping updates tell us about the adaptations by both the human and the exoskeleton. So you can see now that we've built up a fairly complicated diagram, bit by bit by bit by bit, And hopefully every single step of that felt natural from the step that preceded it. And the elements that I wanted you to focus on at any given point, you were clear on what you needed to look at. Conclusions, or how to stop. You could stop by asking for questions. This is a good way to stop verbally, but this is a terrible way to end your slides, because the slide will sit up there as you take your questions, and this slide contains no information whatsoever. You could point to more details on a website. Now, nobody was going to write your website down, but some people might take a picture or scan your QR code. So this is okay now, and it's a more workable technique than it was in the past. Don't do this. Again, contains no information. An idea for you is to leave your contributions on the last slide. A second idea is to leave a call to action on the last slide. A call to action might be your vision or your pitch or your ask, depending on context. I'm actually going to do both. So this is a presentation on tools for clear presentation. We started with a promise. Then we talked about slides and oral presentation heuristics, and how to keep slides clean, and how to direct your audience. We talked about some items that were specific to your design reviews. And we talked about ending with your contributions and/or a call to action. Once again, we gave you a set of tools, and not all of them are going to apply all the time. So don't just blindly use them. They're also recommendations. They're not the only way to do presentations. At the end of VWSI, everyone in the entire program has to give some kind of presentation. My expectation for you as a class is that this class will have, by far, the best presentations in the entire program. Now it's up to you to do it. That was my call to action. Now I'll take questions.
I see what you mean by call to actions, but for us, what would you say like a good call to action is? Because when we're presenting our slides, it won't be to like present an overall understanding of things. It'll be specific to us and what we're doing with our code design.
Well, so it depends on which presentation you're talking about in the context of this class, right? There's going to be a presentation where you're going to have, your call to action will be, and please approve me for my $85 purchase. And there are going to be other presentations where you're not ending with a call to action. Remember, this is an and/or, and again, you don't have to apply every single one of these all the time. So in which case, you might want your ending slide to be a summary of, here's what I learned from my first iteration, and here's what that has pointed me to in terms of buying materials for my second iteration, for example. Make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yep. Other questions?
Are the presentations at the end of the program, are they pre-recorded or?
They will be pre-recorded. Well, actually, so sorry, there's two. There's an in-class presentation that's going to be verbal, that's not pre-recorded. So you're going to have to use everything that you've learned. And then there's a set that's going to be for the final event that is going to be pre-recorded. So use everything you learned and some video editing skills if you have any. Other questions? I will also point out, by the way, that so this presentation sounded probably quite a bit different than some of the other presentations that you've seen, especially from me, because there's a difference between presenting and teaching, right? this presentation is specifically a presentation that's trying to teach presentation. So it leans heavily on presenting, but teaching oftentimes looks a little bit different. Other questions?
A question
Yes.
I have. How, so there is the idea of like using color for like branding or otherwise in a presentation. What are your thoughts about how like effective use of color?
You can use color. It depends on the context, right? Trying to keep your slides clean is a good idea. So don't clutter it up with color unless there's a specific reason for you to, put something in a certain color. There's the idea of accommodating for different kinds of color blindness, like we had talked about last week, right? But color is a lot like other kinds of visual elements that go onto slides. Use them when appropriate if they help you make a point, and part of it is if it helps people remember, for example, like might be a good reason. Sure, but don't make everything rainbows and sunshine because you think rainbows and sunshine look pretty on every slide, right?
For body language, like hand gestures, are they as important on Zoom or?
Yeah, hand gestures on Zoom are tricky. You can try to make hand gestures, but the first thing to figure out is, for example, what is your camera's field of view? So for example, for this talk, and generally for Zoom talks, I make a lot fewer hand and body gestures than I would normally in an in-person talk, just because so for example, I'm gesturing with my hands right now, you can't see anything. It doesn't really matter, right? But if we were in person, you can see my body language and you can also see me gesturing at particular portions of the slide. Sure, great, go do it. But Zoom is different. Other questions? Excellent. Then I anticipate that, like my call to action says, this class will have by far the best presentations at the end of Beaverworks. And if you're concerned about that, go talk to any of the staff, talk to some of the alums to see whether or not that was true last year.